The greatest financial innovation in 1,000 years wasn't born from genius, but from a brutal, physical limitation: the backbreaking weight of metal coinage. In the thriving markets of the Tang and Song dynasties, commerce was literally being crushed under its own success. Conducting major trade meant moving not just goods, but hundreds of pounds of bronze and iron coins, a logistics nightmare that stifled growth and invited banditry. This was the negative constraint that forced a revolution. From this pressure emerged the world's first paper money, a solution so elegant it would catapult China into an economic golden age. But within that brilliant solution lay a fatal, seductive flaw, a flaw every modern economy still grapples with today. The invention wasn't the hard part. The impossible part was controlling it. The Song Dynasty mastered the alchemy of turning paper into purchasing power, building the most advanced economy on the planet. Yet, in less than 3 centuries, they would be reduced to using bales of their own currency as fuel for fires. Their financial system evaporated in a fever dream of hyperinflation. This is the definitive autopsy of history's first and most instructive currency collapse. We will follow the paper trail from its pragmatic origins in merchant deposit slips to its catastrophic end as a worthless state instrument. This isn't just ancient history, it's a blueprint. The constraint of trust, once broken, reveals that the most dangerous force in any economy is not a lack of money, but the unchecked power to create it from nothing. The experiment began with a problem of weight and ended with a crisis of weightlessness. To comprehend the revolutionary nature of paper, one must first understand the profound logistical crisis it solved. Pre-modern China's economy was a monumental engine fueled by cumbersome metallic currency. The primary unit was the guan, a string of 1,000 bronze cash coins, each with a square hole in the center. A single guan could weigh between 3 and 7 pounds, depending on the era's coinage standards. A substantial commercial transaction, say, purchasing a shipment of silk or pottery, could easily require dozens, even hundreds, of these strings. This meant moving literal tons of metal across treacherous roads and rivers, a process requiring armed convoys, cartage, and incurring massive insurance costs and risks from theft. This iron cage of physical money severely limited the scale, speed, and geographic reach of trade. It acted as a friction tax on every transaction. In the frontier province of Sichuan, the problem was exacerbated by the use of heavy iron coinage, deemed so worthless and cumbersome that 10 pounds of it might buy a pound of salt. This tangible constraint created a fertile ground for innovation. Merchants, the pragmatic engines of any economy, began seeking a workaround. They developed a system of credit vouchers and deposit certificates, the embryonic precursor to banknotes. The state, witnessing this private sector ingenuity, faced a choice: suppress it or co-opt it. Their decision to systematize and control this innovation would set history on a new course, proving that the solution to a physical constraint could introduce a far more perilous metaphysical one: the decoupling of value from any tangible object. The formal birth of paper money occurred not in the imperial capital, but in the volatile, commercially inventive province of Sichuan in the early 10th century. Here, private merchants operating pawnshops or secure warehouses began accepting deposits of the oppressive iron coinage. In return, they issued paper receipts, or Jiaozi, that could be redeemed later by the depositor or, crucially, transferred to a third party in payment for goods. This was a monumental leap. A piece of paper, backed 100% by metal in a vault, was now functioning as a circulating medium of exchange. By the 960s, the system had grown so popular and prone to fraud that a consortium of 16 wealthy merchant houses formed a guild to standardize and regulate the issuance of Jiaozi. They used special paper, dyes, and confidential marks to deter counterfeiting. This was private, fractional-free, deposit-based money working with remarkable efficiency. When the Song Dynasty consolidated control over Sichuan, they immediately saw the dual nature of this tool: a powerful catalyst for economic unity and a threat to the state's monetary sovereignty. Initially, the government regulated the guilds. But in 1023, under Emperor Renzong, it made the pivotal move. It shut down the private issuers and established the Izhou Jiaozi Wu, the first official state-run paper money agency in history. The state now monopolized the right to print. Critically, it also altered the foundational rule. While private Jiaozi were fully backed, the state announced it would hold a reserve of only 29% bronze and iron coins against its note issue. This was the genesis of state-managed fiduciary money, currency whose value was based primarily on government decree and public trust, not intrinsic worth. The genie was not just out of the bottle. The state had given it a license to multiply. With state-controlled Jiaozi lubricating the wheels of commerce, the Song Dynasty entered a period of explosive economic growth unprecedented in the medieval world. The convenience of paper money reduced transaction costs dramatically, accelerating the velocity of trade. It facilitated the rise of a truly national market, where goods from distant provinces could be financed and purchased with ease. This monetary innovation synergized with other Song advancements, revolutionary agricultural techniques, massive iron and steel production, output not matched until 18th century Britain, and the burgeoning use of gunpowder and the compass. The government, under reformist ministers like Wang Engshi, began to see paper money not just as a passive medium of exchange, but as an active tool of fiscal policy. They expanded the system beyond Sichuan, introducing new note varieties like the Bianqian for use in the capital region of Kaifeng. The state used note issuance to fund expansive infrastructure projects, maintain large standing armies to defend the northern frontier, and stabilize grain prices through its ever-normal granary system. For over a century, the system worked spectacularly well. The money supply increased, but it was matched and arguably enabled by staggering real growth in productivity and output. This period created a dangerous illusion of perpetual motion. Court economists began to believe they had discovered a permanent cheat code. Sovereign credit could endlessly fuel expansion without consequence. The psychological link between paper and metal weakened among the ruling class. The success masked the inherent vulnerability. The system's stability depended not on the paper itself, but on the discipline of the issuers and the continuous growth of the underlying economy. Two factors that would not, and could not, last forever. The turning point from disciplined monetary tool to expedient political instrument was relentless, external, and expensive, perpetual warfare. The Song dynasty existed in a state of constant, high-stakes confrontation with its northern neighbors, the Khitan Liao, the Tangut Xixia, and later the ferocious Jurchen Jin. These conflicts drained the empire's resources in two direct ways. First, they required enormous direct military expenditure, paying soldiers, supplying armies, and fortifying borders. Second, and more insidiously, they often concluded with treaties mandating massive annual tribute payments in silk and, most importantly, silver. The Chanyuan Treaty of 1005, while securing a crucial peace, obligated the Song to send vast quantities of silver north every year. This created a silent hemorrhage of the state's hard currency reserves, the very assets that theoretically backed the paper Jiaozi. The prudent 29% reserve ratio began a slow, steady erosion. Then came the catastrophic Jinkong incident of 1127. Jurchen forces sacked the capital Kaifeng, captured the emperor, and sent the Song court fleeing south. The newly established Southern Song dynasty was born in a crisis of legitimacy and finance. Its territory was halved, its tax base devastated, but the military pressure from the north was, if anything, greater. Faced with this existential threat, the Southern Song treasury made the fateful choice. It would use the printing press to fund survival. The delicate balance between monetary issuance and economic capacity was sacrificed on the altar of immediate political necessity. In 1160, the Southern Song introduced the Huizi note, destined to become the primary vehicle of its monetary collapse. The Huizi system was flawed from its institutional architecture. Instead of a unified national currency, the government established multiple, separate issuing circuits, each producing notes valid only within a specific geographic region. The intent was to compartmentalize potential economic shocks, but the effect was to balkanize the monetary union and obscure the total money supply. As the central government's fiscal demands grew, it pressured all circuits to print. However, without central coordination, some circuits facing immediate military threats would overissue dramatically, while others might show restraint. This led to wild exchange rate disparities between different circuits Huizi, crippling inter-regional trade. The government's response was to outlaw the movement of notes between circuits, further strangling commerce. More destructively, the link to metal reserves became entirely theoretical. The government practiced direct monetization of deficits. When tax revenues fell short of the enormous costs of war and administration, the imperial treasury simply authorized new Huizi issues to cover the gap. This was no longer about facilitating trade. It was about creating purchasing power ex nihilo to fund state operations. The money supply began expanding in a manner utterly disconnected from the production of goods and services. The early Song discipline was gone, replaced by a short-term political calculus that treated the printing office not as a guardian of value, but as a limitless credit line for a state perpetually at war. By the early 13th century, the economic laws suppressed for decades reasserted themselves with violent clarity. The first symptom was a shift in public psychology. As people lost confidence that Huizi would hold value, they began to spend it faster, a rise in the velocity of money. This behavioral shift multiplied the inflationary impact of the already increased money supply. The classic dynamic of too much money chasing too few goods took hold. Prices, which had been relatively stable for much of the 12th century, began an accelerating climb. Contemporary records, while not perfect price indices, tell a stark story. The cost of staple goods like rice, cloth, and salt began to double, then quadruple, within short periods. The government's response was tragically myopic and self-defeating. As nominal prices for military supplies and official salaries skyrocketed, the state needed ever larger sums of Huizi to pay its bills. Its solution? Print even more, and in larger denominations. This created a feedback loop from hell. Print to pay for rising costs, increased money supply causes prices to rise further, need even more money for the same real expenses, print again. The state attempted periodic currency reforms, swapping old, devalued notes for new ones at confiscatory conversion rates, effectively wiping out public savings. Each reform destroyed trust further, accelerating the flight from paper. The economy began to regress, reverting to barter and the use of any surviving bronze coins. The sophisticated financial instrument that had powered an economic miracle was now an agent of its own destruction, eroding social cohesion and paralyzing the very commerce it was designed to enable. The final, grotesque stage of the experiment was hyperinflation, a terminal condition where currency loses its fundamental functions. By the 1240s, the Huizi was in freefall. Anecdotal evidence from scholars and officials paints a vivid picture of a monetary system in utter collapse. It is recorded that a single string of cash coins, the metal currency, could be exchanged for vast piles of Huizi notes. So severe was the devaluation that transporting enough paper to make meaningful purchases required carts. The notes, once beautifully printed on fine paper with intricate seals to convey authority and prevent forgery, became objects of ridicule and practical utility. There are multiple historical accounts describing people using bundles of worthless Huizi as wallpaper for their homes or as kindling for cooking fires. The symbolic power of this cannot be overstated. The physical representation of the state's promise and authority was literally being used as fuel, its value reduced to its marginal worth as a combustible material. Trust had evaporated completely. The social contract underpinning the Fiat system was broken. Economic activity ground to a halt as uncertainty paralyzed markets. The government, its legitimacy scorched by the financial inferno it had ignited, became powerless to stop the cycle. It continued to print because stopping meant the immediate collapse of the military and the state itself. The experiment had reached its definitive conclusion. A paper money system, divorced from discipline and abused as a tool of permanent deficit finance, does not slowly decline, it combusts. As the Song Dynasty financially imploded, its conquerors were observing with acute interest. The Mongols, under Kublai Khan, defeated the southern Song in 1279 and established the Yuan dynasty. Contrary to their barbarian stereotype, they were pragmatic assimilators of effective administration. They inherited the wreckage of the Song paper money system and conducted a deliberate post-mortem. Their diagnosis was that the concept of paper money was sound, but the Song's lack of absolute, centralized control and fiscal discipline was its fatal flaw. The Yuan's brilliant finance minister, Liu Bingzhong, designed a new system called the Zhongtong Jiaochao. It was a radical attempt to correct Song errors. They instituted a unified, nationwide currency with no regional circuits. They established a silver reserve fund and promised convertibility. Most drastically, they banned the use of gold, silver, and copper in everyday transactions, forcing the population to use their paper notes. Initially, this Mongol-imposed discipline worked, creating a stable medium for their vast empire. However, the lesson of history repeated itself. Within decades, the Yuan emperors, facing their own extravagant spending and military campaigns, succumbed to the same temptation. They began printing to cover deficits, the silver reserve became fictional, and the yuan currency too spiraled into inflation. This sequel proves a critical point. The failure was not one of culture or specific administration, but of inherent political incentive. Any sovereign with a monopoly on currency creation and unchecked fiscal needs will eventually abuse it, regardless of the civilization or the harshness of the initial rules. While paper currency hyperinflated, a silent, decisive referendum was taking place in the marketplace for hard assets. Gresham's law, bad money drives out good, operated with perfect, brutal efficiency. As the Huizi deteriorated, anyone possessing tangible stores of value like silver, gold, bronze, or even durable goods like silk, engaged in one of two behaviors: hoarding or flight. Wealthy households, merchants, and monasteries buried their metal wealth, withdrawing it from the circulatory economy entirely. This internal hoarding contracted the real money supply, exacerbating the economic paralysis. Simultaneously, a massive capital flight occurred. Silver, the premier high-value monetary metal, was smuggled out of the country en masse. Chinese merchants, seeking to preserve their capital, used maritime trade routes to exchange silver for stable foreign commodities or other currencies in Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean world. This external drain was a lethal hemorrhage for the Song state. It represented a total loss of confidence not just in the paper money, but in the state's ability to ever restore sanity. The government's own policies accelerated this flight, as it continued to pay foreign tributes and purchase strategic military goods from Central Asian traders with hard silver, not its own depreciating paper. The dichotomy was fatal. The economy of real assets and international trade operated on a shrinking base of sound money, while the domestic economy choked on a flood of unsound paper. This bifurcation meant that even if the state wanted to reform, it lacked the hard currency reserves to anchor a new system. The lifeblood of the real economy had already voted with its feet, leaving the paper shell to wither. The technical failure of monetary policy was compounded by a systemic failure of governance. The Song bureaucracy, renowned for its meritocratic examinations, became a key vector of the currency's decay. Local officials and military commanders in distant provinces, chronically underfunded by a central treasury drowning in its own paper, took matters into their own hands. They began local, unauthorized printing of notes or credit vouchers to pay troops, procure supplies, and grease the wheels of regional administration. These quasi-currencies, sometimes called white notes or military tickets, further fragmented the monetary system and destroyed any semblance of central control. Corruption flourished. Officials with access to printing plates or seals could create personal fortunes, debasing the currency for private gain. The central government's attempts to audit and control the total money supply were hopeless. The accounting was opaque, the different regional circuits were uncoordinated, and the sheer volume of notes, official and unofficial, in circulation became unknowable. This information black hole was critical. You cannot manage what you cannot measure. The state was flying blind, making decisions about issuance based on fiscal desperation rather than any economic data. Furthermore, powerful interest groups, including parts of the military and connected merchant syndicates, benefited from the chaotic inflation through insider deals and speculation, actively lobbying against any genuine stabilization that would curb their opportunistic profits. The monetary system was no longer a public tool. It had become a private battleground for rent-seeking, ensuring its path to ruin was politically unstoppable. History records several brave, intelligent officials who diagnosed the cancer and proposed radical surgery. The reformer Yi Shi in the early 13th century advocated a shock therapy approach, a massive, one-time recall and burning of all excess Huizi, coupled with a strict return to a full silver reserve standard. He understood that only a painful, deflationary shock could purge the system and restore trust. Another school, led by figures like Zheng Dexiao, argued for legally binding issuance limits tied transparently to state revenue, not expenditure, effectively creating a constitutional constraint on the treasury. Some emperors, particularly Xiaozong in the late 12th century, made sincere efforts. He used scarce state silver to buy back and burn Huizi, temporarily stabilizing its value. But every single reform effort was ultimately sabotaged by geopolitical reality. The Mongol military threat on the northern frontier was existential. Any policy that contracted the money supply or raised taxes to balance the budget risked immediate collapse of the front lines, as soldiers went unpaid and supplies dried up. The political-military imperative always trumped the long-term economic one. Each failed reform had a devastating secondary effect. It demonstrated to the public that the state's promises of stability were empty. It created a time inconsistency problem where the public rationally expected any period of restraint to be followed by even greater issuance. This destroyed the credibility essential for any future recovery, locking the dynasty into a death spiral where the only perceived choice was between slow death by inflation and fast death by military defeat. The collapse of money is never a sterile, technical event. It is a social catastrophe that unravels the fabric of civilization. The hyperinflation of the Huizi devastated the Song's social order in predictable yet profound ways. It acted as a regressive tax, crushing the salaried middle class, civil servants, soldiers, scholars, and urban artisans, whose incomes in fixed amounts of paper became worthless. Their life savings evaporated, leading to desperation, indebtedness, and a loss of status. Conversely, those with access to real assets, landlords who collected rent and grain, merchants with inventories of goods, corrupt officials who could speculate, saw their relative wealth skyrocket, exacerbating inequality to destabilizing levels. Peasants, caught between fixed tax demands, often still calculated in nominal coin terms, and volatile prices for their produce, faced ruin. Banditry and local rebellions increased as economic distress spread. The social contract between the state and its people, already strained by military defeats, was shattered by the financial betrayal. The mandate of heaven, the philosophical bedrock of Chinese imperial legitimacy, was understood to depend on economic well-being. By presiding over a monetary collapse that impoverished its subjects, the Southern Song court was seen as forfeiting that mandate. The loss of trust was comprehensive: trust in the currency, trust in the fairness of the system, and ultimately, trust in the ruling dynasty's right to rule. This internal rot weakened the state's resilience far more than any external army, making the eventual Mongol conquest not just a military defeat, but a societal surrender. The Song paper money experiment cast a long shadow over all of Chinese history and offers timeless lessons for monetary economics. The immediate successors, the Yuan and later the Ming dynasties, repeated the cycle with eerie familiarity. Initial discipline followed by overissuance and collapse. The Ming's Deming Baoqiao in the 14th century failed so completely that China largely abandoned paper money for centuries, reverting to a silver-based system until the modern era. The core lesson is the fundamental political problem of fiat currency. A state with a monopoly on money creation faces an irresistible temptation to use it as a tool for short-term political survival, especially to finance war or avoid taxing its citizens visibly. This creates an inherent time inconsistency, the long-term need for stability conflicts with short-term political pressures. Without a credible external constraint, like a gold standard, a currency board, or an independent central bank with a strict inflation mandate, the trajectory toward debasement is probabilistic, if not inevitable. The Song experience prefigures every modern hyperinflation, from Weimar Germany to Zimbabwe to Venezuela. The mechanisms, monetizing deficits, loss of reserve backing, erosion of public trust, flight to real assets, are identical. The experiment proved that the technology of money is secondary to the institutions that govern it. A sophisticated note with anti-counterfeit seals is worthless without sophisticated institutional guardrails against the state's own self-interest. The invention itself was a triumph of human ingenuity. Its repeated failure is a tragic lesson in human nature and political fallibility. While the Song's hyperinflation is an extreme case, the underlying dynamics of their paper money experiment resonate in modern central banking. The core tension remains, balancing the stimulative power of currency creation with the imperative of maintaining trust. Consider quantitative easing, QE, post 2008. Central banks created vast amounts of new electronic money to purchase assets, aiming to stabilize financial systems and stimulate growth, a form of controlled, directed monetary expansion far more sophisticated than song printing. The critical difference is the institutional framework. Independent central banks with explicit inflation targets acting within economies possessing deep, credible bond markets. Yet, the philosophical debate echoes the song. Critics warn of fiscal dominance, where monetary policy is effectively dictated by government borrowing needs, risking a long-term erosion of value, a direct parallel to the song's deficit monetization. The modern concept of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, raises ancient questions about state control over money, privacy, and the potential for even more precise or oppressive monetary policy. The song story is a stark warning against blurring the lines between treasury and central bank, between funding government and managing currency. It teaches that trust, once lost, is catastrophically expensive to regain. Every modern monetary authority implicitly operates with the ghost of the Huizi in the room, understanding that their power is not just technical, but psychological, resting on a foundation of credibility that can be dissolved far faster than it is built. The final audit of the Song paper money experiment yields a paradoxical verdict, a transformative success in invention, an abject failure in stewardship. The Chinese solved a monumental practical problem and unlocked a new plane of economic organization. They demonstrated that trust-based money could be more efficient than commodity money, enabling commerce on a previously unimaginable scale. This was a cognitive leap that changed the world. Yet, they also provided history's first, full-length case study in how to destroy that trust. The failure was not in the concept of paper money, but in the governance structure surrounding it. They created a powerful tool without building an immutable shield against its abuse. The constraint of weight was solved, but no equivalent constraint was placed on human temptation. The lesson is not that paper money is bad, but that its viability is entirely a function of the political and institutional constraints placed upon its issuers. Is the money supply ruled by law or by political expediency? Is the issuing authority independent of short-term fiscal demands? Are there clear, transparent limits? The song answered no to all these questions and paid the price. Their civilization did not burn down in a single conflagration, but it was fatally weakened by a slow burn of devaluation that eroded its economic vitality, social cohesion, and political legitimacy from within. The paper money experiment, therefore, stands as humanity's first great encounter with a force we are still learning to master, the abstract power of finance, which can build empires or reduce them to ashes, all on the foundation of collective belief. The journey from the heavy guan of bronze to the worthless bales of Huizi is more than a historical curiosity. It's the foundational story of fiat currency. We witnessed a civilization confront the double-edged sword of its own brilliance, solving a physical constraint only to be ensnared by a psychological one. The Song Dynasty's journey teaches us that the hardest part of finance isn't innovation, but restraint. The most dangerous economic tool isn't scarcity, but the illusion of limitless abundance granted by the printing press. If this deep dive into the first great monetary collapse changed how you see modern economics, from central bank policies to the crypto revolution, then you understand why these blood money files are worth examining. This story connects directly to our next investigation. We will jump forward over 6 centuries to a new world and a new monetary disaster. Next time, on Blood Money Files, we uncover the story of the Mississippi Bubble in 18th century France. We'll meet John Law, a financial wizard who convinced a kingdom to replace its gold with paper, promising unparalleled wealth. We'll see the same patterns of genius, mania, and catastrophic collapse repeat in a European court, proving that the lessons of ancient China are not learned, only rediscovered, at great cost. If you think the Song Dynasty's experiment was a one-time failure, wait until you see what happens when entire fortunes are built on stock tied to a fictional North American gold mine. The experiment continues. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss the next chapter in the history of financial folly.